Hello and welcome to GCVS's top tips on funding applications. What we've done is put together quite a lot of information from other sources, but brought it together into one useful webinar that you can have a look through. So stand by. Let's just talk about grant making trusts and foundations. What exactly are they? So most of them are registered charities, so they, like most of us, have to comply with charity regulation. They can be set up by a whole different range of organisations and individuals. Quite a lot set up by families or individuals. We've got J.K. Rowling with her Volant Charitable Trust, the Hugh Fraser Foundation, Carnegie UK Trust, who's been set up since the 18th century. So a long history of individuals and families recognising that they have made some money and they want to give it away to support and improve the lives of people in their community. But it's quite interesting to look at the ones who put their own name stamped all over it and others that remain slightly more anonymous. Companies are increasingly, as part of their corporate social responsibility requirements, are increasingly looking at ways to support their local community, and it's been shown to have an effect on staff turnover. So staff who are happy about the business's links to the local community, feel fulfilled, they tend to stay longer with the company. So it's good for business for businesses to be involved in their community and with grant making. Bank of Scotland Co-op Foundation, with all of these, as the company is making money or not, then there's more money or less money to give away. At the moment, we've got Greg's Foundation doing extremely well, following sales of the vegan sausage roll, probably plummeting slightly in lockdown, but bouncing back up again. BBC Children in Need, the BBC's community organisation, highly successful, a very professional sort of fundraising machine, but also so they raise their own funds and give grants. So rather than the other businesses where they're dependent on the company making profit and percentages of their shares are given, BBC Children in Need raises its own money and then gives that funding away. We've got groups like, particularly Glasgow, the Trades House, set up in the 17th or 18th century, where all the plumbers, joiners, builders had their own little, all kind of almost like a trade union, where they would support members of their profession who were less able or were out of work. So those historically have lasted quite a long time. You've got Rotary. Then you've got other charities who give grants. So SCIAF in Scotland, a very effective fundraising organisation, but they don't deliver projects. They fund other organisations in the developing world. But in the UK, we've got Save the Children, we've got Action for Children, who are themselves fundraising organisations who also give grants to other charities to deliver services. So that's who they are. You can already see that there is not a sort of one size fits all approach. These are very different types of organisations, and you have to get into them and understand their story while you're making the application. So what do? Traditionally, they used to give you grants for stuff, to buy stuff. Now they're becoming a little bit more forward-looking. So yes, they will give you grants for computer equipment, laptops, whatever you're needing for giving out to people disadvantaged in this increasingly technological world. Or they'll give revenue, so supporting you to deliver your services, look at projects, so they will fund a particular project or activity or aspect of your work that you're delivering. And sometimes they ask for match funding, so some funders will give you 50% on the grounds that they think that you can then attract the other 50% from another funder. So capital equipment, if you're setting up a new service and want some equipment, a new room, want chairs, tables, whatever, new office space, capital grants. Revenue grants to fund the costs of delivering that service and that project, or core funding is becoming increasingly the actual costs of just keeping your organisation afloat, paying some of the rent, the electricity, some salaries. And what funders are doing is recognising that you need some support towards that, and they're being very enlightened about how they will help you to do that. So constantly reinventing things that you're doing as projects to make it a new project that you could apply to a funder for is just a waste of everybody's time. So look at core funding, and increasingly funders are looking at supporting those core costs. Some of them proactively invest in supporting you. They'll be involved in helping you to spend your money. So they'll want to make sure that the project that or the activity that they're funding you for is very well delivered, and they will help you to do that. And some of them actually lobby and campaign. So you've got some of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, where they actively campaign and support social causes. So they're coming out quite publicly against universal credit. So a grant-making trust, but they also genuinely act in what they see as being the best interests of the sector. So they're very, very different, very idiosyncratic, and it's good for you to understand their background before you start to approach them. So where did they get their money? So donations. So if an individual or family member has made some money, or understandably, when J.K. Rowling sells film rights or whatever, she makes a donation to her charitable foundation. So families do that. Some of it is interest on invested. So the likes of the Carnegie funding, that is a huge chunk of money that has been invested, and each year the interest on that money is given away, which means that if the bank interest or stocks and shares or the stock market is down, then that type of foundation may have less money to give away. So they're dependent on having a lump of money invested, an endowment, which is then makes profit, which the foundation can give away. Sometimes it's profit share, as we said with Greggs and Co-op, and if the company is making money, then the trust and foundation has money to give. And like BBC Children in Need, some of them raise funds. So you need to understand how the organisation is working. Across the UK, we've kind of got about 4,500 trusts. So they're registered with the Charity Commission. You can find them. In Scotland, we've probably got about 1,000 trusts, but only 10% of them give grants of over £10,000. So please don't think that all trusts give huge amounts of money for you to do whatever you like. Most of them, well, 90% of them give smaller grants, and that might be all that you need, and that's fantastic. But be careful, do your research before you submit your application. So let's look at setting in that application for the amount of time, effort, energy, exit, all that sort of stuff that you're putting in. You can make about £7 per pound from trusts and foundations. So for example, if you're running a special event or a fundraising event or activity, usually you can expect to make 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 kind of return. So for every pound you're spending on events, and you would expect to make about £3 back. Sometimes you can do more, sometimes it can be less. But for trusts and foundations, you'd be expecting about £7 for every pound of effort and energy you're putting in. But that can depend on the type of organisation you are and how attractive your cause is to funders. So as we'll see, sometimes causes go in and out of favour. So at the moment, we would expect mental health will increasingly become a focus, I think, for grant making trusts and foundations. So the rate for the number of applications you submit, if you're getting 1 successful application for every 3 that you submit, that's fantastic. That's obviously great research. You're doing really well. 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 is about average at the moment, and 1 in 8 or 1 in 10 is if you're going for a very specific type of funding from very specific funders. So that kind of should give you an idea of the sort of response rates that you're getting. But this is about putting in the best quality of application to the right funder, and that should increase your success rate, and that's what we'll be helping to do through this session. So let's look at the top foundations. So these are the top grant-making trusts and foundations across the UK. There's a publication published every year of the top 300, and these are the ones at the very top. Wellcome Trust is the drugs company, which invests quite heavily in medical research, but also helps with health promotion. They give away significant amounts of money, and look at the amount that they have invested, have huge reserves invested. The Children's Investment Fund was set up by a husband and wife, and they have another person who's a trustee, and they wanted to fund children's activities across the developing world. They're now divorcing. The trust's been split, and now there's been a big court case. So the fund has got to give money to another foundation that the other side of the family is setting up. So there's a whole family history in here. These are not just money-making machines that are standing by to give money to you. There's a whole story. Leverhulme is Unilever, Lever Brothers, Comic Relief, as you know, in Children in Need. Garfield Weston's linked with Associated British Foods, Primark, and what's it called? Fortnum and Mason in Piccadilly. You know, there's a story behind all of these trusts, and you need to get into the story. Do make sure that you don't rush back into the office or rush back to your computer and start sending applications to all of these because you see they're in the top 10. They're very, very different, and they need to be approached differently. So mass mailing trusts, sending the same application to lots and lots of different trusts, just doesn't work. So they're the top across the UK. As you can see, they've got lots of money you know in reserves and standby invested, and they're giving away lots of money. In Scotland, we've got things a little bit different. So National Lottery Community Fund and the Cora Foundation don't fit in the top 300. Cora Foundation gives away some grants from the Scottish Government and actually works in partnership with some of the big UK funders. So the money that they're giving isn't all their own money. National Lottery Community Fund are the biggest, by far the biggest funder in Scotland, and you would do well to make very good contacts with them and keep in touch with them, become their best friend. Their teams of their grants teams are fabulous and very interested in speaking to you and getting to know your work. So don't be, with all of this, don't be scared about getting in touch with funders and asking them for their advice. They want to help you. They want to get applications that are good and that are fundable. They don't want to waste your time or their time in putting applications or them having to assess applications, which aren't great. So Cora Foundation used to be Lloyds TSB Foundation for Scotland, administer a whole range of different size grants. We'll talk about them in a minute. The Robertson Trust are about to reopen with very significant funding across Scotland, major funder, and we're hoping that their new funding is going to be very accessible and appropriate for all different types of organisations. We've got J.K. Rowling's Volant Trust. Brian Souter, he and his sister Anne Gloag own Stagecoach. So making significant amounts of money and giving away significant amounts of money. Skiaf, again, there's a story. Northwood, if you're doing anything in Dumfries and Galloway, or Ganachie, if you're doing anything in Perth and Kinross. So have a look at all these different funds. R&A, I mean, who knew that the Royal and Ancient Golf Club in St Andrews had a foundation? So lots of stories. One size does not fit all. You need to understand your funders and why they would want to support your cause. Now, just before we get into it, there are some rules. So there is a code of fundraising practice. This applies to all fundraising activity carried out across the whole of the UK. So it tells you how you should be working with trusts and foundations. It tells you how you should be opening your collecting boxes. It tells you about managing volunteers. So do have a look at the code of fundraising practice to make sure you're not contravening regulations in any of your fundraising activity. Now, risk is always worth thinking about. There's always risk in fundraising, but you need to be sure that this is an appropriate risk for you to be taking, and just weighing up the consequences. If you have one application that goes into a large funder for a large amount of money, then you sit back and wait for 6 months. That can be really risky, because if that funder turns around and says no, you've got no plan B. So be careful, make sure that you're minimizing your risks, but all fundraising is risky. Then think about the ethics. So on the BBC News the other day, we had Aberdeen City Council being sort of lambasted because they were going into an arrangement with BP, whereby BP was going to work with them on their carbon neutral policy. But the council was being suggested they shouldn't be working with an oil company. Um, so think about the sources of the funding, just in that quick rattle through I did earlier. You've got alcohol, you've got Primark, you've got different types of things. Would it really be okay for you to be linked with those funders? Have a think about what's the right things, and your trustees should be involved with all of these conversations. They should be being clear about what is okay and what is not okay for your foundation to do. So who is appropriate to approach for money, and what you're doing is trying to raise as much as you possibly can to improve the lives of your beneficiaries or to solve the challenges that you want to see. But be careful about the ethics. You can't take money from a dubious source and then expect nobody to know. We live in a world where everything is public, much more so than you'd ever imagine. And so be careful and make sure that you're really clear about what you're doing and why that's in the very, very best interests of the people that you call your charitable purpose. All right, so risk, ethics, and the code of fundraising practice. Really good for you to have a think about before you even start fundraising from grant making trusts and foundations. So let's look at the application process. It's quite a clear process. Now, most funders follow this kind of structure. So you put in your application, they will assess it. Now, sometimes that means, remember those days when you used to have people coming to visit? Sometimes an assessor would come out to visit, or you get a phone call, or sometimes the assessment is being undertaken behind the scenes. They will Google, they'll check Facebook, they'll look at what it says on the website. They'll be doing all of that research, and sometimes you won't even know about it. So the funder will review your application. If there are any gaps in the evidence, then they may well phone and ask for any further information they need, but not always. They will then decide whether to make the award or not. Great stuff. And then they'll send out an offer letter to you, which may well have conditions on it. So the conditions might be to only spend the money on the purpose for which you applied for, which is absolutely right, but they might put other conditions on as part of the grant. So make sure that these are conditions that you can comply with and that actually make sense for you as an organisation. Then what you want to make sure is that you're doing that monitoring, you're gathering the information that you're going to need to do the reports to the funders on the work that you're doing and the difference that their funding is making. So set up your monitoring. To be honest, you should have been thinking about this almost as you were setting up and designing the application form. So how are you going to know that the project that you're delivering is successful, or that the difference that you said would be made is being made? So how are you going to be able to prove that that's happening and that's moving forward? So monitoring, and then a funder might ask you every 6 months or every year to evaluate. They want you to take a step back and look at what the project has changed, what's changed, what hasn't. Has something different happened? Has something happened quite unexpected that you hadn't foreseen? So think about that sort of evaluation. Then you're submitting your final report as part of the application, but what you would want to do is to have talked to the funder about your next steps. So have they got any suggestions on how you could continue the project if that was appropriate? Or this might be you coming to the end of a 3-year relationship with the funder. But how are you going to think about what happens next? And really, you should be thinking about this a good year before if you've had funding for 3 years, at the end of year 2, you should be starting to apply for the next step, next funding opportunity. All right, so reapply. Or it might be that the project's just set up and is doing a particular piece of research that will take a year and then the project dies. That's fine. But if you want to keep it going, then think about working with the funder. If you've got a good working relationship with them, why wouldn't the funder want to keep funding you to deliver the project and continue it? So it's all about relationships here. Don't be frightened to build those relationships with funders. They are all human beings. All right, so that's the process. Now, why should the funder support you? Now, we've got 24,500 charities, registered charities in Scotland, and that's not including the big UK-wide ones that come in and work all over the UK. You've also got masses, tens of thousands of local groups and organisations who are also seeking funding. So the competition for funds is fierce. The most important part of your application is what we in fundraising terms call the case for support. So this is where you're telling the story, you're making the argument for why you should be getting that funding. So why your organisation should be getting that funding rather than the cat and dog home round the corner or some other suitable cause. So why you? Why your cause? That's your case for support, and you should be really clear. So what's happening? What's the challenges that you're dealing with? What are you going to do about it? What will change or what needs to change? And also, what evidence is there that changes are required? Now you want to put this together into a clear, compelling and concise argument. And this is about the potential, it's convincing the donors about your beneficiaries, the difference that this activity can make to your beneficiaries. It's not about, how wonderful you are as an organization and you were set up in 18, blah, blah, blah. Doesn't matter. This is about the difference that your work makes and the difference that the project or the activity that you're suggesting will be making. So think through very carefully. This is the bit on the application form where the funder says, describe your project in 150 words. Clear, compelling and concise. That doesn't mean using lots of abbreviations in the thing. That means making sure you've got a really strongly worded argument for why you're the very best organisation to receive funding to deliver the activity that you've suggested. All right, so your case for support is very, very important. You might have lots of different cases for support. So if you've got a number of different projects, if you've got, for example, a mobile creche, you might have a different case for support for that, whereas your after school service might have a different case for support. So think about the different types of arguments that you'd be using for why those are the very best projects and why they should be funding. It's all about the difference that you're making for the beneficiaries and what the beneficiaries want to change. So what evidence do you have that people want things around your area to change? So what you want to be careful about here is don't become over professional. Don't think because it's a funding application and you're asking for quite what you see is quite a bit of money that you need to jump into a very professional, strange language. And also remember that sometimes when we're working within organisations, we have our own sort of secret code that we use in abbreviations. Funders might not understand that. So make sure that you're keeping it simple and being really honest and telling some real stories. For example, I was working with an organisation a couple of days ago, and they were talking about person-centred approach to children who'd been excluded of school. But what they actually do is they take children to a farm, and the children measure out food for the animals, look after the animals, all that sort of stuff. But if you'd read the report, you wouldn't even know that what they were doing took place on a farm. So because they become ultra professional instead of just taking that real story. So tell the difference. In one of my other lives, I used to be a trustee of a grant maker. And what we found was that the best applications, the one with the strongest argument, came from volunteers, people who were absolutely passionate about what they were doing and the difference that it was making. And that story, that passion, that commitment came across in the application, and they always won against those that had been completed very professionally, looked beautiful, but didn't have that passion, that commitment, that belief in the difference of what you're doing. So make sure that you can harness that information and put it into your applications. Be careful about the language that you're using. So some funders still want to look at what's wrong. So they're looking at what we call the deficit models. They want to know that you're top of the list of the index of multiple deprivation. You've got lots of people involved in substance abuse or selling, and what they want you to list are all of the bad things that are happening, and therefore what this money or this project could do to make things right. So that's one particular style of funder that tended to be a kind of slightly old-fashioned way of approaching. What we now have is a group of funders who want to look at the assets of your local area. So your glass is half full, you already have some stuff, some great stuff going on in your area, and what you need is a little bit more money just to top up the glass. So be really should, and you can tell this by the language that the funder is using in their application. So if they're talking about problems, if they're talking about needs, if they're talking about disadvantage, then they probably are looking at a deficit model. So they want those lists. They want to know the offending rates. They want to know how bad life is for your the people that you're working with. But other funders want to know that you already have people doing some great stuff and that you can make a big difference by just adding extra value. So have a look at the language that funders are using on their application form and on their website, and then make sure that you reflect that style back to them in your application. Where to find all these potential funders? So we gave you a list earlier of the top ones in Scotland, but how within those, how do you find which ones are the best ones for you? There's quite a lot of paid for services, but the best free website at the moment is being run by SCVO called Funding Scotland. You can register and you can carry out your searches. They do have a paid version, which is very useful, and then it means you can save your searches, and it's a little bit more responsive and more tailored to your organization. If you register, they'll send you weekly updates on if there are funders and what's happening in the funding world. So well worth registering with them and signing up. So it sort of saves you having to start from Oscar's website or another funding source to find it. So they'll help you. Funding Scotland website, you must remember that, you must try that. Now, if I were looking at kind of my top tip ones, it's not necessarily about going for the top 10 all the time, but these are sort of the most flexible funders. And I'm sorry, but we do have to include the Glasgow City Council logo. Some of you will have been supported by them and are being supported, but it's really important to show that you have some kind of commitment with Glasgow City Council. Other funders find that reassuring. So if you can show either you're receiving funding or you're being involved in some of their networks and community planning, local planning, their networks, then that's really useful to put into your application, and it reassures funders that the work you're doing is endorsed. So Sutra, as we've said, they fund a lot of sport, sort of children, and primarily fund Christian causes. We've got the National Lottery Community Fund that will fund anything that's to do with the people or communities, or they've got a Young Start program as well, which is for children and families. So have a look at their funding. They've got a small grants scheme which gives grants called Awards for All. So that's grants of up to £10,000, and then there are larger schemes of up to 150,000, up to 500,000. So do have a look at National Lottery Community Fund for their Awards for All. So for grants of up to £10,000, it's an online application and you can submit that. For any of the other programs, you actually have to talk to one of their funding team before you actually get the form sent to you. So do have a chat with them, read through the stuff on their website and then phone them up. Certainly within Glasgow, they've got area funding teams. So make contact with your local area team. They understand if you're southeast, northeast, they understand the area and they'll be able to help you. And what they want is to get a fundable application. So they want to help you to get it right. The National Lottery Heritage Fund used to be all about saving buildings, but is much more than that now. So they're looking about biodiversity, about sort of managing to retain cultural activity, so storytelling and history and archives and museums rather than just buildings. Bank of Scotland, they've got a range of funds which become available. So small grants, medium grants, large grants become available, lots of different programs. It's well worth keeping an eye on their website and see what's happening. Foundation Scotland are fairly unique. They act on behalf of lots of other organisations. So for example, Volant, J.K. Rowling's trust, is actually administered by Foundation Scotland, and they administer funds on behalf of individuals and businesses. And also they do some fundraising themselves. So again, in terms of websites to watch, Foundation Scotland is definitely one to do that. At the moment, they're administering the National Emergencies Appeal funding on behalf of the UK. So they're giving grants in Scotland to coronavirus related activity. So do have a look at Foundation Scotland. And again, they're really accessible, really friendly, lovely people, worth getting to know. We've got some of their top tips for applicants coming up later in the session. Cora Foundation, as we said, administer funding on behalf of some of the big UK funders and on behalf of Scottish Government. They've been very actively involved in giving out the coronavirus funding coming from Scottish Government, but are brilliant. They have their own small grants programme, which is grants of up to £8,000 through Henry Duncan Grants, and then they give larger programmes. They administer Scottish Government's funding for overseas international funding, so lots of different types of funds there. Hugh Fraser, they like funding the west of Scotland and love funding things to do with children and families, so if that's your activity, then they're a source for you. The Robertson Trust funds a huge amount of different types of work, mainly aimed at combating poverty and trauma. So do have a look at their criteria and their information if you're involved in working in those two areas. Children in Need, as it kind of says on the tin, fund projects to do with children, improving the lives of children and young people. Again, they have a small grants programme which offers grants of up to £10,000 and then larger grants of just over £10,000. And again, the staff team are brilliant, so if you've got any questions, make contact with them. The Weir Charitable Trust, we have now, following the death of Colin Weir recently, we've got the Weir Foundation giving small grants, mainly around sports at the moment, but worth keeping an eye on. J.K. Rowling funds lots of different activities to do with parenting, women who've been affected by domestic abuse. So if you're working in that area, that's well worth a look at. And Comic Relief are again funding. They raise their money through the TV appeal and give it out to groups working with people, disadvantaged people. They launch particular programs at particular times. They have a couple running at the moment, so well worth keeping an eye on. So if I'm looking for funding, these tend to be my sort of top funders. But you've got to do what's right for you as an organisation. You know, is it right to receive money that's come from the lotteries where it's gambling, or the Robertson Trust where they own the Edrington Group, which makes and sells alcohol. So, you know, have a think through the ethics of funders and where that money is coming from, but then the brilliant work that you can do when you're spending it and how you can make the world a very different place. So this is a bit of research. It's a little bit old now, but it stays the same. So this is a piece of research done by NFP Synergy, and these were what funders said were the hallmarks. So this is what made an application stand out for them and made it appear much, much more fundable. So that you know, the top one up there, that you understand the grant maker. So this isn't about the brilliant case of support that you put. This is about you understanding them and that you reflect what they want to achieve. You know, a strong idea and what you're going to do. Why are you the very best people? You've got the very right people in place to deliver. So you've got experience, or you're employing, or you're working with other organisations. All right, clear and succinct communication. This is not about waffling for Britain. This is about making sure that you can tell a clear story about what you're doing and the difference that your work will make. That your finances are in order. Now, we've got challenges with online application forms at the moment where some of them automatically total up as you're going along, others don't. Make sure that your finances are clear and that they add up. Um, because why would a funder give you their money if you can't even submit a budget properly? And you can see how things happen. If you've drafted an application, somebody else has had a look at it and think, oh, well, we need a little bit more on volunteer expenses or travel. They've amended that figure and then nobody has actually sat back and check the final total adds up before they've hit send. So do take time to get that finance right. Ask them for the right amount of money. So if a funder's maximum grant is £8,000 and you ask them for £20,000, you're not going to get it. You've wasted your time, you've wasted their time, and trust me, they will remember that application. So be careful, make sure you're doing things right. Look at the information that they're offering you on their website. Foundation Scotland, brilliant grant maker doing great work in Scotland, but they're really clear about why applications fail. You haven't even read the guidelines. Sometimes it can be quite daunting. There's quite a lot of information, but you really do have to make time to read through those guidance. The guidance is there to make sure, A, that you're really clear that they're the right funder for you, and then to make sure that the application you're submitting answers the questions that a funder's asking. Meet the deadline. Now, don't wait till 10 minutes before the closing time to submit your application online. Make sure you get it in early, because that way, if the assessors are waiting for applications, they've got time to give you a call or drop you an email to ask for more information. If you submit it late, then there's no spare time to be doing that. So write it in easy and simple language. Don't use acronyms, or if you're using them, then explain them. Don't assume that the funder already knows who you are, and don't assume that they actually know the activity. So make sure that you're being really, really clear. What's becoming more and more important is you must show that you're absolutely connected with your local community, so that you know that the community is involved and why they want the activity you're proposing to happen. All right. Don't exaggerate it. This is the value, but also the difference that you're going to make. Be really clear. Don't set yourself up to then say, oh, we're going to have 300 people coming along and they're going to, it's going to be able to help them sort of overcome disadvantage and poverty. Now, in reality, that can be really tricky to measure. So make sure that you're just setting up something that's achievable and realistic. Other things, make sure your governing documents are up to date. So be clear that you should have the right number of trustees, your meetings being held, that your constitution's correct, your most recent audited accounts, check that they were submitted on time. If you're a registered charity, make sure that you know what is being said about you on Oscar's website. So OSCR, the Office of the Scottish Charity Regulator, they have a log. So for all registered charities, your accounts, your annual return is on there. If you submit it on time, you get a nice little green square. If you've been late submitting it, you get a red square. All right. Again, back to that finance. Does everything add up? Make sure your accounts are clear. Yes, if you've got independently examined accounts or audited accounts, make sure that they explain what you do. If you're holding any money in reserve because you need to do some work on a building, make sure that you explain why you're holding that money. Be honest, about income. It's not a terrible thing to have reserves, but you want to explain why you're holding those reserves, why you're keeping them, what they're for. All right. Now back to the grant, be really clear about what that's going to cover, what the difference is, and back to that measurement. Remember we were talking earlier. So how will you measure your success? How will you know what difference you're making? How will you be able to prove that the project has been successful? All right, so there's the top tips from Foundation Scotland right now. Monitoring evaluation, I don't want to harp onto this too long or too much, but please make sure that you're able to show the difference that you're making. If you don't understand quite how to do it or you're worried, two things. One, here at GCVS, we offer training courses, so you can Zoom or face-to-face training on outcomes and impact, or there's lots of information online. Evaluation Support Scotland has got resources on its website and useful tools. So there's lots of help for you. If you get stuck, just ask. Then you've submitted it, you're going to put it all together. Have a look at other funders. Make sure there are other fundable projects. What else within your work can you be doing and could you be sort of selling? Gather the stories. I worked for a while, quite a long while, with Sense Scotland, and I used to make sure that I went on the summer holiday programme each year, and then you got the great stories to tell about the difference that was happening with our children and young people's lives. All right. I always collected all the thank you letters and anything that came from donors or from individuals or from families, so you got those stories to tell. Photos are always worth having. Make sure you've got permission, but being able to use photographs always strengthens applications. And don't be frightened about putting photographs in or putting links to an online video or you'll put something on your website. Some applications enable you to do that, so don't be frightened. All right, so if your application is unsuccessful, obviously ask for feedback. Now, what happens if you ask in writing, you tend to get something a little bit more bland. If you're asking it for it by phone, then you might get something. And what to do is make sure you listen to what that feedback is. Sometimes it might be that your application just wasn't eligible. There's something within the wording that you should have or could have changed. So that's not to say that you can't go back again. All right, so the feedback there's sort of one of the sort of fundraising gurus, a guy called Bernard Ross, and he says there are 9 types of no, but only one of them is go away, never darken our doorway. The other ones are all no, but it was the wrong time, it was the wrong amount of money, it was the wrong project. All right, so make sure that you keep, this is the start of you building research, building a relationship with your funder. Do your research again. Is there something you missed when you're doing the application? Reapply. Keep an eye on their criteria, because quite often funders change their criteria. We've got National Lottery Community Fund reviewing their strategy. We've had some other funders reviewing their strategies over coronavirus. So moving forwards, things will change. Make sure you stay up to date. That research that you did 6 months ago about the funder may well be very, very wrong. So make sure you keep yourselves up to date. If you're successful, yes, celebrate. Read and look at the application, look at the conditions, and make sure that there are things that you can comply with. Don't wait until you get your 6-month report to say, oh no, we weren't able to do such and such. Make sure right up front that you look at the grant conditions and talk to the funder if they don't suit you. Then start working out how you're going to gather the information which you need. Or if you're a fundraiser and you're not directly involved in delivering the project, then how are you going to make sure that the project team gives you enough information to enable you to do the projects, to do the reports to the funder? Or are you going to get the project team themselves to write the reports? All right, make sure you get your reports in promptly, and make sure that you start thinking about reapply. Build a relationship, and this isn't about inundating the funder with lots of information, but it might be, if you've been very successful about something, you would want to let that funder know. The likelihood is they'll be following you on Facebook, they'll be looking at LinkedIn, they'll be looking at your social media. Make sure that you're talking to them and making sure you're announcing what's happening, what's changing, the difference that you're making. Think about sustainability. So when most of us thinking about keeping our organization or keeping our project going, we only think about income. But we're actually 5 different pillars of sustainability. And there's a really useful toolkit called The Lasting Difference, which will help you to look at your organization and to look at wider things than just sustainability. So moving forward, there's likely that there will be continue to be less people going into offices, more people working from home. How are your services going to have to adapt to that? So this toolkit can help you to do that. Now, in all of this, we've talked about fundraising, we've talked about grants making for trusts and foundations. In law, if you are a registered charity, the buck stops with the trustees. In law, the charities are legally responsible for fundraising and making sure that you have enough money to deliver your work and keep the organisation going. So there's the guidance on the Oscar website. They've got guidance for trustees around fundraising. And this is the sort of top tips that come from the Chartered Institute of Fundraising. And they've got a really useful guide called Trustees and Fundraising, a Practical Guide. They're saying everything starts with a strategy. You should have a fundraising plan, so grant making trusts and foundations are only a small part of your overall fundraising. As we spoke earlier, grant making trusts and foundations are giving you a significant return, so possibly £7 for every pound, but the likelihood is that funding will be restricted to particular areas or particular activities. So how are you going to fund all those other parts? So you need a mix of restricted and unrestricted funding coming in. Think long term. This isn't just about thinking about the next 6 months. Where's your organisation going to be in 5 years' time? What resources you need to get to that? And think long term, how you're going to make that difference and what fundraising do you need to be there. Do the right thing. So it's back to that ethics thing. You make sure that you're working in partnership with the right organisations and that you're living the values of your organisation. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, so don't be dependent on only one funder. As we said earlier, a mix of different types of fundraising puts you in control. It leaves you with a more balanced funders and can help you be more sustainable. Play the parts. Remember, this is back to guidance for trustees. Trustees should be thinking about what they can do to help the organisation move forward and to develop it. So remember, you might be doing all the fundraising, filling in all those applications, researching and filling these applications, but the buck stops with the trustees. We can't fail to meet and mention the coronavirus situation. So there is a website, the Coronavirus Third Sector Information Hub, and they have a funding section in there which will keep you bang up to date to all of the coronavirus specific funding that's available. So that's helping you to get PPE, change your office space, or new projects, developing new projects, new services following the impacts of coronavirus. So there's lots of funding, the list there of the Scottish Government funding, and there's some independent funders. So please keep an eye on that website. And again, you can register with them and they'll send you out a weekly update on what funding has been launched. So keep your eye on that, and that should be able to help you with the changes that we're all having to make in a coronavirus world. So how we can help, we've got masses of online resources on the website, so do have a look. Lots of information there. So all of the documents that I've spoken about, the Oscar guidance for trustees, the Chartered Institute of Fundraising guidance for trustees, the Code of Fundraising Practice, the Lasting Difference Toolkit, Evaluate Support Scotland, all of the links to that stuff is on the GCVS resources page. We do regular funding bulletins that come out. You can subscribe to that free, or if you have any questions, you can contact if you email cld@gcvs.org.uk. That's all from me so far. Thank you very much and good luck with your fundraising.